Picture this. You're stepping into the thick, fog-drenched streets of London's East End. It's 1888. This is a place already struggling under the heavy weight of extreme poverty, but it's about to be pushed into a state of absolute, unimaginable terror by an evil literally no one saw coming. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tearing into the facts, the fictions, and the chilling remaining evidence behind history's most notorious unidentified serial killer, Jack the Ripper. Let's get right into it.
The sight that we saw, I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than of a man. That right there, that is the raw, unfiltered horror of a landlord describing the aftermath of the killer's final crime. And honestly, it perfectly captures the sheer, paralyzing terror that completely gripped the East End. You have to understand, this wasn't just a string of violent acts. It was an absolute media frenzy. Newspapers were exhaustively covering every gruesome detail for a population that was reading more than ever before. People were morbidly fascinated, sure, but they were also furious. The police were coming up totally empty-handed. The public outrage got so intense that both the police commissioner and the Home Secretary were actually forced to resign under the pressure.
But to really understand this mystery, we've got to strip away the myth and ground our investigation in verified historical facts. And that starts with what investigators call the canonical five. Now, over the years, a lot of theories have floated around suggesting the killer might have claimed up to 11 lives. But historically speaking, the hard evidence definitively points to these 5 confirmed victims. These were all deeply impoverished women, tragically pushed into prostitution just as a desperate way to survive the brutal realities of Victorian London. And they ended up falling prey to an absolute madman who was essentially playing this sick game of cat and mouse with the authorities. And the violence escalated fast. We're talking about a terrifyingly brief window of time here. It all kicks off in the early hours of late August, with Mary Ann Nichols found dead in Bucks Row. Barely a week goes by before Annie Chapman is discovered. And here's where things get really chilling. A divisional police surgeon, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, took one look at the highly specific mutilations and realized something horrifying. The killer clearly possessed basic anatomical knowledge. We're talking potential medical training here. The terror then absolutely skyrockets on September 30th, eventually concluding with the horrific murder of Mary Kelly in November. Let's actually pause and zoom in on that September 30th date. 45 minutes. That is the impossibly tight time frame of what's become known as the double event. At 1 a.m., the killer strikes first, murdering Elizabeth Stride. But her throat was cut hastily, and there weren't the usual severe mutilations. The police theory? He was interrupted. But here is the truly crazy part. Instead of fleeing into the shadows to lay low, he just keeps going. A mere 45 minutes later, just a short walk away, he completely mutilates Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. He did all of this while actively dodging a massive, swarming police presence that was already on super high alert. Now, as you can imagine, the killer left almost zero solid clues behind. But after that double event, police did stumble onto something. They found a bloodied piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron, and it was dropped right near a chalked message on a wall, displaying some anti-Semitic graffiti that was pretty common in the area back then. But here is the absolute kicker. This evidence was found east of the Eddowes murder site, meaning the killer was heading back toward the first murder of the night. Think about that for a second. Why on earth would he zag straight back into a labyrinth of streets that were literally crawling with cops? Well, it heavily suggested he wasn't just a traveler passing through, he was a local, someone who lived right there in the slums and knew exactly how to vanish into the alleyways completely unseen.
So right around this time is exactly when the legend is truly born. On September 27th, a news agency receives this incredibly chilling letter addressed to Dear Boss. The writer is just totally taunting the authorities. He threatens to clip his next victim's ears off. He even casually mentions, I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle to use as ink. And he signs off with a name you definitely know. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Now look, a lot of modern historians and investigators firmly believe this letter was a total fake, probably cooked up by some opportunistic journalist looking to sell more papers. But whether it was real or fake, it did one very permanent thing. It cemented that terrifying moniker in the history books forever. And the public climate? It just spiraled into total morbid obsession. By mid-October, a guy named George Lusk, he was the head of a local vigilance committee helping the police, he receives this absolutely grotesque package. It's signed from hell. And inside, half a human kidney. You can imagine the absolute panic. Everyone immediately assumed it belonged to the fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes, because her killer had actually removed that exact organ. Now, down the line, authorities ended up writing this off as a really sick prank pulled by a medical student, but honestly, it's just a dark reminder of how chaotic, terrified, and totally sensationalized London had become at this point.
So you've got this impossible puzzle, right? Bloody aprons, taunting letters, a ghost in the fog. It ended up spawning an entire community of incredibly dedicated people known as ripperologists. For well over a century now, these investigators, both amateur and professional, have basically dedicated their lives to poring over every single tiny detail of this cold case. They are absolutely desperate to put a face to the monster. So now that we've laid out the historical facts, let's step into the investigation phase ourselves. Let's take a hard look at the primary suspects. Okay, flash forward to 1903. Sir Melville Macnaghten, the head of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department, manages to narrow the official suspect list down to 3 top guys. First, you have Montague Johnson Druitt. He was a barrister who came from a medical family. Interestingly, he vanished and was found dead in the River Thames just weeks after the murders mysteriously stopped. Then there's Michael Ostrog. He was a Russian doctor and known criminal who couldn't provide an alibi, but there was literally zero physical evidence linking him to the crimes. And third, Aaron Kosminski. He was a local Whitechapel resident with a known violent hatred of women who actually ended up being confined to an asylum.
Let's actually zero in on Kosminski for a second, because a few years back, a massive claim made global headlines. An author and a molecular biologist stepped up and basically said, "We found the smoking gun." They claimed they found a rare DNA mutation on Catherine Edoway's shawl that perfectly matched descendants of Aaron Kosminski. Case closed, right? We got him? Well, not quite. It turns out the scientist made a massive error in nomenclature, just a simple typo on a keyboard if you can believe it. The mutation they found was actually 315.1C, and that one is incredibly common. It's shared by over 99% of people of European descent. Just like that, a $1 million investigation instantly fell apart. It really shows you just how incredibly careful we have to be when we're trying to separate hard facts from exciting theories. Of course, when the hard facts start drying up, human nature loves to lean into the sensational. And over the years, conspiracy theorists have pushed some seriously wild ideas. For instance, have you ever heard of Jill the Ripper? The theory here is that the killer was actually a female midwife. Her having bloody clothes wouldn't have raised any eyebrows walking down the street. It's a fascinating thought experiment for sure, but it totally ignores the fact that every single eyewitness account pointed to a man. Then you have the super popular royal conspiracy pointing the finger at Prince Albert Victor. People love this one, but it's widely scoffed at by serious historians because there's just zero proof of a royal cover-up. And we can't forget the famous painter Walter Sickert. People have poured millions into trying to match his handwriting paper to the Ripper letters, but the evidence against him is still completely circumstantial. So if we cut through all the noise and the wild theories, who actually makes the most logical sense? Well, a lot of experts point straight to Joseph Barnett. Here's why. Barnett actually lived in the exact same room as the final victim, Mary Kelly. His job, a fish porter, which means he definitely had that crude anatomical knowledge and knife skills. We also know they had these huge escalating fights over her going back to prostitution, and he ended up moving out just 10 days before she was found dead. Now look at the crime scene. Her clothes were folded neatly by the bed. That strongly implies she wasn't killed by some random client she brought in. She was likely murdered in her sleep by someone who had intimate, easy access to the room. And the absolute most compelling detail? Once Mary Kelly was dead, the canonical murders stopped entirely. But even with highly logical suspects like Barnett sitting right there, people still crave that dramatic, movie-ending closure. And nothing proves that quite like the story of James Maybrick. He was this wealthy cotton merchant, and suddenly a diary is supposedly found hidden under his floorboards. It reads like the holy grail of true crime. It literally has a confession signed by Jack the Ripper, and it came with this old pocket watch that had the victim's initials scratched into it. But the reality? It was completely heartbreaking for investigators. The scrap metal dealer who brought the diary forward, a guy named Mike Barrett, eventually just openly admitted he forged the whole thing. It's crazy, but it's a stark reminder of how easily we can be blinded by fake evidence just because we so desperately want the story to finally be resolved. So if all the specific suspects keep falling through, what are we really left with? Well, if we aggregate all the historical eyewitness descriptions, the people who caught those fleeting, terrified glimpses of the killer in the dark, we can kind of bring ourselves face to face with the Phantom. He was likely a man between 25 and 35 years old, somewhere around 5'5" to 5'7" tall. Stocky build, fair complexion, sporting a mustache. He was usually seen wearing a dark overcoat and a dark hat. Years later, Scotland Yard's Violent Crime Command team analyzed the profile and described him perfectly. They said he was evil incarnate. yet appeared perfectly sane and frighteningly normal. A frighteningly normal man who just walked right into the heavy fog of the East End and disappeared into history. Here we are, well over 100 years later. The physical evidence has severely degraded, the witnesses are long gone, and the science has repeatedly hit these frustrating dead ends. Which really just leaves us with this final lingering question to think about. Will Jack the Ripper's true identity ever actually be discovered through some miraculous unearthing of new evidence? Or is this famous cold case just another victim to time, destined to stay unsolved forever? Thank you so much for exploring the shadows of Whitechapel with us in this explainer. Keep that curiosity sharp, and we'll catch you next time.